Welcome. In this video, we will look at demystifying raw editing in Affinity Photo 3. Once mastered, you will know how to avoid dull, flat images. Furthermore, as your skills improve, you will know how to retrieve information in burnt out or black areas of images. Raw editing allows you to unlock the full potential of an image. Most importantly, it is non-destructive and you can return to it at any time for further editing. Here we have some boats at rest in a river estuary with the tide out. I think you'll agree it is relatively dull, looking flat and pretty uninteresting. So let's see what we can do to give this image a bit more impact. I've opened the image file in Affinity Photo, and you will see it has taken us straight to the develop persona. You will see a toolbar on the left hand side, but today we are just going to focus on the basic functions that we need to get right. These will cover exposure and lighting, contrast and detail, color balance, lens distortion if we need to, and saving the image file for further editing in the photo persona. There are a number of useful tools on the top toolbar. It can be very good to see a before and after effect when we're doing editing. So by using the split screen function or the mirror function, we can actually compare the image to before editing and to the current point of editing. Some of the tools are a bit more advanced and can be looked at in another session. We have a number of panels on the right hand side. The top ones cover the all-important histogram and metadata and some others. The next row down cover our editing functions, and this is where we will focus most of our time. When I'm editing, I always have the histogram on view as I'm making changes. This includes all the important information relating to the balance of light and contrast within a particular image. This image does not appear to have any burnt out areas or areas that are too dark. And this is also reflected in the histogram, which is relatively evenly spread across the graph. The histogram is relatively flat, which is reflected in the relatively dull appearance of the image. When editing any image, it can be very useful to see where we've lost any detail in the bright or dark areas. On our top toolbar, we have a number of icons. One will show clipped highlights, one will show clipped shadows. We can also show clipped tonal range and focus peaking, but we will leave those until another day. So I'll always switch on clipped highlights and clipped shadows. I can now demonstrate the effect of this. If we increase the exposure, we will see in the bright areas red patches appearing. This is showing the areas that we're losing detail through these parts of the image being overexposed. You can also see that the histogram has shifted sharply to the right and is going off the edge. In most basic images, we want to avoid this. Let's now use the black point slider to increase the depth of the dark areas. If we go too black, then the clipped shadows show as blue. This means we've lost detail in these areas. You can also see the histogram is shifted to the left and is going off the edge. We could aim to correct this by increasing the exposure, but as you can see, we now have clipped highlights in the bright areas again. The secret to editing in RAW is to get this balance correct. When I'm editing, I use these two sliders to remove clipping at both ends of the range. I use them until the clipping just disappears, and this retains maximum tonal range within this image. You can also see the histogram is now not quite so flat. It's now a good idea to look at what effect these changes have had on the image. So if we want to look at before and after, we can click on the split view icon on the top toolbar. As you can see on the right hand side, we have before, on the left hand side we have after. We can slide across and see the effect of these changes on different parts of the image. If we're happy, we now go back to single view. We can also look at the impact of the brightness slider. Whereas exposure affects the whole image, the brightness slider is mainly affecting the bright areas, i.e. the highlights. This can be used to our benefit in many images. Once again, we can look at before and after. If we're happy with the results, we'll keep it. If we're not, we can always go back to zero. So we've mastered the exposure and lighting, and now let's move on to contrast and detail. If we move down the panel options, we will see a tone curve option. There are a number of presets for this that we can use. I find it better to make any adjustments to a tone curve under its own separate panel. We will look at that a little bit later. Moving further down, we have a contrast slider option. We can use this to increase or decrease the contrast to our choice. Be careful though, increasing the contrast can start to introduce clipped shadows and clipped highlights. It may be that you find you get good contrast in the clouds, for example, whilst losing detail in the black areas of the foreground and the trees. One way around this is to move further down to the shadows and highlights sliders. We can use the shadow slider until we just lose the loss of detail in the blacks. The highlight slider can be used as well. However, be careful with this. If you reduce the highlights too much, you can get a grey sort of muggy appearance, which isn't always very attractive. Once we've achieved the balance of contrast that we would like, we can move on to the clarity of the detail within the image. Below the contrast slider, there is clarity and texture sliders. We can increase or decrease the clarity to our taste. Once again, be aware that increasing the clarity can start to clip the highlights. With these sliders, it's probably important not to overdo it, as they can start to look a little bit artificial, but the choice is yours. Texture is a good way of improving detail within the image, but once again, don't overdo it or it can look a bit artificial. As before, we can use the split view to see before and after. If we're not happy with the results, we can go back to changing the sliders until we are. Now that we're happy with the exposure, lighting, contrast and detail, we can move on to the color balance. Further down on the panels, there is a white balance option. We can use the slider to increase or decrease the temperature of the image making it warmer or colder, depending on the results that we want. We can even add a little bit of basic tint if we wish. As before, we move the sliders until we see the results. In the editing panels, there is an option under Lens which allows us to remove or add lens distortion. This is worth looking at if you feel the image proportions don't look quite right. There is an option in the Details panel for sharpening or removing noise, but I tend to prefer to do this after I've done all other editing. The next panel is for tones. We have the option for a tone curve, black and white, or split toning. Black and white split toning I tend to use at a later stage, but the curves can be very useful for making subtle changes to the contrast. The classic curve for this is a gentle S shape. It's a small change, but it can have a huge impact. By clicking on the History panel, we can see the effects of the tone curve before and after. I'm happy with the changes that we've made there, so we'll now move on. So let's return to the basic panel, and we can decide whether we want to make any more fine adjustments to the results. We can adjust the sliders, keeping an eye on the histogram all the time to see that we have a nice even spread. To my eyes, this is looking good, but if we go to the split view, we can have a look and see if we want to make any more changes by comparing the starting image to our current image. I think you'll agree it's no longer flat and boring. It's now a much more interesting photo. Now that we've achieved the results that we want, we can look at how to develop and save this image. On the top left-hand corner, there is an output. If we just go for the pixel, then we're saving this image as it is, but we can't make any further editing changes to it. We have the options of developing the output with all the editing changes embedded or linked. Both work well, but the embedded image can take up a lot more disk space. The choice is yours. Once we've decided, click Develop. And we have now moved from the Develop persona to the Photo persona. We have now moved from the Develop persona to the Photo persona or Pixel Studio. Here we can make many more adjustments on a global or localized basis. We are able to work with live filters and adjustment layers. But what if at one stage we decided that we weren't happy with the contrast? If we wanted to make further changes to that or any of the other adjustments that we made in the Develop Studio, we can return to it at any time. To do that, we either double click on the base layer or we hit the Develop button on the top left corner. We are now back in the Develop Studio. The sliders are already set to our previous adjustments, and we can use these sliders to make as many further adjustments as we like. This only works if we have developed the raw file as an embedded or linked image file. Now that we've looked at the basics of editing raw data files, let's move on to something a little bit more challenging. As you can see, the interior of this church, it's got some very bright highlights, and we're in great danger of losing detail. If we switched on the clipped highlights warning, we can see a lot of red, a lot of areas where detail has been lost. We want to get back as much detail as we possibly can. The histogram is showing clipping at both the right and left sides, and the middle is quite flat. So let's start by adjusting the exposure. To reduce the exposure, we're starting to get more detail in the highlights, and the clipping can be made to disappear. Whilst we're doing this, the histogram is moving totally to the left. There are quite a few dark areas. Let's set our black point until we are just starting to get clipping. And if we make small adjustments to these sliders, including brightness, we can see the best balance that we can achieve. There's no one set preset for every image. You've got to be prepared to move the sliders until you get the best results for the image that you're working with. After making numerous small adjustments, we've probably achieved the best result that we can for the highlights. I feel that we can improve the shadows. Let's work on the tonal range by making adjustments to the contrast. We move down the panels and we come to the contrast slider. The contrast definitely improves, but we lose a lot of detail through clipped shadows. We'll carry on at the moment. We'll work on the clarity and the texture. The best way to reintroduce detail into the clip shadows is to move down to the shadows and highlights setting. And by moving the shadows slider to the right, we will bring more detail back in. As you can see, we have got some clipped highlights in the window on the right hand side. We will try making further adjustments to the exposure to correct this. Further small adjustments can be made to the contrast with a tone curve. As before, we will look at a gentle S setting. We will use our before and after split screen view, and we can see a huge difference in the results with the changes that we have made. The main focus of this image is the altar area at the end of the church. There's a lot of image on both sides of this that isn't really helping, and we could consider removing this. Also, if we look at the altar rail, we can see it is not level. It is sloping downwards towards the right. On the toolbar on the left side, there's an icon for a crop tool. So we will open that. But before we crop, we will look to straighten. There's an icon on the top for straighten. We click on one end of the alter bar, we drag along to the other end and release. The image has now been slightly rotated to make it level. Now we can draw in the sides and cut off the bits of image that we don't want. I'm going to cut it off at the pillar on the right hand side and the edge of the opening on the left. In my opinion, this is a much more balanced image. If I now hit return, it has done the crop and straightening in one move. We can use the history settings to look at before and after the crop. We can use the split screen view to look at before and after our editing changes. Now that I am happy with the results, I can use the develop button to output this image, and as before, I can return to it at any time to make further changes. The very bright areas of this church interior have made it a challenging image to work with. However, if we zoom in on the church window and wall detail, we can see that we've retained all the information that we need. We have edited two images, one relatively straightforward, one quite challenging, and we can be very happy with the results. Raw editing is a very valuable tool to master in Affinity Photo. Good luck with your images.